So, Ben, I've talked to so many people recently that have come to this place to where they just feel. I think they're in mourning almost. It's if there's no chance of winning and turning the corner. How big is this battle that we're in right now, and what are the odds, and how do we turn it?
I mean, it feels almost like the final ideological battle of the United States, because what we've really come down to is a belief that the United States is something worth fighting for and upholding, and a belief that the United States is merely a vestige of evil institutions that ought to be torn down. And we had some of this battle in the 1960s. And I will remind people who are feeling despondent that it felt like in the 1960s the battle was completely lost. And then, of course, the Reagan era came about and restored a lot of that feeling. Other countries have experienced something similar. Israel, for example, experienced a post-Zionist era in the aftermath of the Oslo Accords that spanned for about 15 to 20 years. And then it turns out that their enemies didn't go away, and now the entire Israeli population is center-right. So one of the terrible facts about humanity is that America's enemies don't go away no matter how much navel gazing we do. So, while it is true that the United States could theoretically really rip itself apart over a lot of these issues, eventually our enemies will show up at the gates. And when there's an enemy at the gates, it tends to unify Americans in a way that ideological discussions do not. I mean, I think a lot of historians have pointed out quite correctly that a lot of the fragmentation in American politics took place in the immediate aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Union. And then we came back together a little bit around 9/11 when there was a feeling that there was a common enemy seeking to destroy American values. And now, because it doesn't feel like there's an existential threat to the United States, we're kind of turning in again. But I think it's pretty clear that there are some fairly large existential threats on the horizon. Now, the bad news is that if it takes an existential threat on the horizon to unite Americans around the greatest set of principles ever devised by man, then we're doing something deeply wrong. I guess the reality is that the history sort of pushes you back into a more patriotic situation, no matter how hard you wish to run away from it and declare yourself a world citizen.
Yeah, and that's not really a victory for America itself. I mean, because when I first heard Donald Trump start talking about the deep state, it bothered me. I was like, stop with the deep state stuff. But that is true. There are people deeply embedded in our government that I think hate our system and are trying to overthrow and trying to have their own way. If we don't get to the root of this problem, which is education, which is honestly people like George Soros that are funding all of this. This is a show we're watching, Ben. This is a show, and they're not going away.
No, and I think this is one of the areas where Republicans really have missed the boat, is that the left has been fighting a culture war. And again, I hesitate to make this a left-right divide, because I think that there are some old-fashioned liberals who just disagree with me on tax rates and the role of government, but still agree with fundamental American rights as expressed in the Declaration of Independence. I think you saw some of them sign that Harper's Weekly letter, ripping cancel culture. But it is true that the assault on America's values that came predominantly from the left in the 1960s took place on a cultural level. And the Cultural Revolution always precedes the governmental revolution. So the Cultural Revolution that took place in the 1960s, the right never fought back on those grounds. They did a little bit with Reagan, but Reagan was a governmental figure. The fact is that we ceded the field of battle. I mean, you know this better than anyone, Glenn, is trying to get conservatives to understand that things like Hollywood entertainment is actually kind of important, that the content that your kids consume may be more important than the politicians you elect. Getting conservatives to understand that is very often very difficult, because conservatives tend to think, okay, well, these kids will grow up, they'll go into the business world, and then they'll have to live a real life, they'll have to earn a buck, and they'll realize the tax rates are too high, and they'll they'll swivel toward a more conservative position. Well, what happens when all of those woke microaggression SJW types, what happens when all of them exit college, they go into the workforce, and they don't get shaped by the workforce, they shape the workforce instead? And you're seeing that happen right now in corporations around America, where CEOs are now being told what to do by woke interns. I mean, it's insanity. You run a company. I run a company. What we're watching right now is nuts. If my employees came to me and dictated a certain brand of politics that I was supposed to embrace that I disagreed with, they'd be on the breadlines the next day. But corporations, because they're so afraid of being sued and they're so afraid of the bad press, have decided that it's much easier to simply give grease to the squeakiest wheel. So the right fought back politically when they should have fought back culturally. They fought back by electing Republicans, but electing Republicans while the culture shifts to the left is rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.